So, Storm Shadow missiles strike Russia. Again, this isn't yet the licensed missiles that we should be expecting in future. That U.S. is going to sign a quote-unquote licensing agreement with Ukraine, and then EU states that have those U.S. weapons can send them over to Ukraine, and Ukraine could slap a Ukrainian flag on them and pretend that they made them, and send them into Russia. That's what's coming in the future. This is just UK providing Ukraine with Storm Shadow missiles to target Russia. And it's not an accident that it happens right after Keir Starmer resigns. It's a message saying UK is still completely anti-Russian. And even if Keir Starmer resigns, the UK is not changing course.
Let's talk about some news. And let's start things off with the Storm Shadow missiles fired into Voronezh. And another Storm Shadow missile was fired into the Belgorod region as well. Now, I've heard varying reports which claim that anywhere between 1 to 3 Storm Shadows was fired into Voronezh in Russia, hitting an Iskander components and semiconductor facility. The Storm Shadow that was fired into Belgorod targeted a cement factory. And we're talking about British Storm Shadow missiles. Mm-hmm. So anywhere between 2 to 4 Storm Shadows were fired into pre-2014 Russia. Some mainstream media outlets are trying to trick everybody by saying these are Ukrainian.
Unlike drones, missiles create serious destruction. They have a lot more explosives, a lot more momentum, firepower. They make big booms. So they can do serious damage. This is another example of Putin not enforcing his red lines and having a semiconductor factory get damaged.
Storm Shadow missiles. For example, the Kiev Post has a title, Ukrainian Storm Shadow hit Iskander-linked electronics plant, say Russian sources. Ukrainian Storm Shadow missiles do not exist. No such thing as a Ukrainian.
Exactly. Ukraine doesn't make any Storm Shadow missiles.
Storm Shadow missile. This is a straight up UK attack into Russia. And then we have Belarus. We have Belarus.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Zelensky has threatened Belarus to attack Belarus in, I think, now 7 days if Belarus doesn't remove some military equipment from its border, but which it won't do. So Zelensky has no business dictating what Belarus does within its country.
The escalation that is taking place between Le Goblin Vert and Belarus. I thought that Le Goblin Vert was not serious about attacking Belarus. I talked about this 2 days ago. That most likely what we were seeing with Zelensky's.
Just for those less familiar with that part of the world, here's Ukraine, here's Russia, here's Belarus. Belarus is Russia's ally. And if Ukraine attacks Belarus, it now has a huge new front to defend. And they're already short of men, so that's why no one really thought they'd attack Belarus. But then again, Europe seems determined to escalate the situation in Ukraine, and that might be one way to do it.
Threats to attack Belarus was some sort of a distraction or a deflection so that he doesn't have to acknowledge or discuss the Ukrainian drone that hit the school bus of Belarusian kids. And so he changed the narrative to Belarus needs to be attacked instead of answering questions about the Ukrainian drone hitting a civilian target, a school bus with children on their way to a football match. But you know what? I think that Le Goblin Vert is actually serious about attacking Belarus. After so many threats and warnings that he's made over the past 2 days, he's not stopping. He's not giving it up. He continues to warn Belarus and continues to talk about the 7-day ultimatum in Belarus removing their radars and air defense.
Yeah, threaten the country that you're going to attack it and then tell it, get rid of all your defenses so it can attack you even easier. Fuck Zelensky.
interceptors and stuff like that. So it definitely looks like Zelensky and Ukraine is serious about striking Belarus. And the Kremlin is taking it seriously. Putin is going to be speaking with Lukashenko. And they are taking these threats from Ukraine very seriously, and they're going to start planning for these possible attacks from Ukraine into Belarus. Could be happening before the 7-day ultimatum.
Yep.
I can see the collective West and the Zelensky regime using some trickery, saying you have 7 days to remove your air defense installations and your radars, and I can see them striking before then. But we should probably expect some sort of an operation into Belarus.
Just appreciate for a moment how absurd Zelensky's demands are. You have Ukraine, which is attacking an ally of Belarus here. So these are not friendly countries. Ukraine is demanding that Belarus removes its radars from its borders. This is the era of drone warfare, where Ukraine is sending swarms of drones into Russia. The first defense against swarms of drones is having radars on your border to see them coming so you can try to shoot them down. What Zelensky is demanding of Belarus, which is not an ally, is that it basically completely lowers its defenses so that it can't see like any Ukrainian drones coming. It's insane. The demands of Ukraine from Belarus are insane.
The worse things get on the front line in Donbass, the more likely that the Zelensky regime is going to launch some sort of an operation into Belarus in order to distract away from the collapse of Konstantinovka and Liman. I wonder what Putin is going to tell Lukashenko. Do you guys think that Putin is going to tell Lukashenko to follow his policy of maximum restraint?
Okay, let's look into this more in this video.
Who plan for a diplomatic way out. But on the other hand, these countries, they are falling apart, but in the process, they're throwing off lots of debris, and lots of that debris is now landing in big Russian cities. And so, Putin is coming under more pressure not to kind of take the slowly approach, which he has been doing, in terms of just letting, Europe collapse around its support for Ukraine, to actually hitting much harder in the short term to say, well, back off. Actually, enough is enough, and stop providing these long-range capabilities. And while you're at it, you need to rein in, your puppet Zelensky, who's becoming increasingly erratic.
Well, in fact, speaking of Zelensky and erratic, I guess it depends on which side of the ledger you're on, because from the Russian side, he seems erratic and he seems much more bold of late. And then from the other side, he could be seen as, out of control or so. But many in the West are seeing him as, hey, this guy's getting a backbone, man. I kind of like it. That's what some of the things I've heard. But let's just take a look at how we got to where we are.
Ukraine is still losing on the battlefield. But what it is doing is it's hitting deeper into Russia with all these drone attacks. That, of course, it's not Ukraine getting a backbone. All these drones are coming from Europe, and it's basically Europe intensifying its attack on Russia. Ukraine is just a launching platform.
Back up just a little bit here. So in the 1st of June, Zelensky mixes, according to the New York Times, mixes taunts and peace talks and offered to letter to Putin. But he was bragging at the time about strikes on St. Petersburg. And if anybody actually read that letter, it was...
NASDAQ took a big poop today. I don't follow it daily, but I do expect some very massive market correction at some point. Yeah, it's a big fall, but it's not... I'm expecting this, but more. But that'll happen when the oil market spike, which will happen, I think, beginning sometime in July. But definitely July-August period. I've said it before. I expect the futures price to touch 150 at least. Big... They held it down at 100. So this because of the derivative markets and all the chaos that the spike in oil would cause there. Now that it's fallen here, at this point, you have all of Wall Street repositioning itself that knows that the spike is coming. Of course, it's always retail investors that get screwed. And then sometime in July and August, this is going to spike up way up here. Yeah, it's going to be fun to watch.
It was an open letter, so it was not an actual diplomatic engagement. It was pretty much just saying, hey, I'm going to mock you to your face. And as though the Ukraine side was in the period of superiority and the Russian side was begging for a negotiation, which, of course, didn't happen. It wasn't long after that, in fact, I think it was just a day or two after it, and for the second time, as there was an economic forum attended by President Putin in St. Petersburg, they, I think on consecutive days or 2 out of 3 days, struck targets that had a lot of flashy stuff like these, dark clouds or whatever inside St. Petersburg, which cast a pall on it and made it look like even when President Putin is in the area.
They attacked the St. Petersburg Economic Forum to make Putin look bad and make Russia look unsafe.
That they can't be, the Russians can't defend against it. That was part of the interest.
And if you remember from when we were looking at those attacks, St. Petersburg, it's here. So the attacks were coming in from the sea, from here. Now, so Ukraine would have you believe that their drones left and went all the way up like this and went into, no, that's too far. And they wouldn't have any explosive charge. Everything would need to be fuel in the drone. These drones that hit St. Petersburg were launched from Latvia, apparently, or one of the Baltic states in any case, and they went up. So drones launched from NATO territory through NATO airspace, hitting a far somewhere that Ukraine could never hit on its own. That's why I say Europe is already involved in this war, even though the European people don't know it yet.
There, but that didn't stop there. So Russia didn't. I think they did strike some things back. They did hit Kiev after that, but not anything severe, not anything serious. Then here we go. Now here, just the last couple of days, Zelensky is saying Moscow will burn if the Russian strikes continue. And then I think on that, I believe this was the 23rd. That's today, actually. On the same day he made this claim, Ukrainian drones set Moscow refinery ablaze in a major attack in the Russian city. And of course, this is another big, huge black smoke coming up. Militarily, it probably doesn't cause much more than an embarrassment for the Russian side, but it does cause an embarrassment. And it makes Zelensky look more and more tough. And the Russian.
You mean how similar to how China is involved as far as supplying weapons to Iran? You mean? No, it's more than that. Drones fly very low to the ground, so it's not like airplanes at 100,000 feet up that you can detect on radars miles away. The Earth is curved, so if you have a drone flying very low to the ground in the middle of Latvia, radars in Russia can't pick it up. It's too low. So Russia cannot, absolutely confirm where these drones are coming from. There's pictures here from boats of these drones coming in from the sea, but where they were before that, that is why the plausible deniability, like the Europe claims these drones went like this up here, Ukraine, or that's another possible route because they avoided Belarus airspace. But that's too far. These drones don't have that type of range. So they had to have been sent from Latvia. The drones themselves are made in European factories. And they're normally brought to Ukraine, and Ukraine slaps a coat of paint on it or does a few last screws together. And they say it's made in Ukraine. Then they send it to Russia. For the attacks up here, I don't know if they even bothered with that. You have EU-produced drones going to Latvia, being sent off, and then hitting St. Petersburg. So that's basically an EU attack on Russia with no Ukrainian involvement. Maybe they brought over a few Ukrainians when they launched them to pretend that it was Ukraine doing it. But these are EU attacks. Oh, I did not understand the question at all. Have a good day. Okay, sorry. I'm going off on my own. You mean similar to how China is involved with supplying weapons to Russia? Actually, China is supplying Russia weapons, the components to make the drones to Europe too. Russia's complained about that several times to China. The EU factories use components from China, assemble the drones, and then they're shipped to Ukraine or sent off from the Baltic states.
Now Zelensky seemed to be more and more bold, has issued an ultimatum to the Belarusian side because he's claiming, I think this was just today, he's claiming that Belarus is providing electronic means of communication and navigation capabilities to Russian missiles and drones and whatever. And he said either that has to stop, and you can see this quote here. What's the point of saying that Lukashenko doesn't want to be in the war? Let him remove this equipment. Let him switch it off. I think a week should be enough time for him to do that. Zelensky told a news conference on June the 19th, if he doesn't do it, we'll do it. So,
but he's also demanding they remove their radars. And That's like lowering their defenses. So he's also mixed in there some pretty insane demands too.
That now then you're giving ultimatums to Russia, you're giving ultimatums to Belarus, you're striking St. Petersburg, striking Moscow. Are we seeing a big escalation in this war, and will it go anywhere?
Well, it won't go in Zelensky's favor. I mean, he's playing to the galleries of Western political support that he's receiving because he wants more money. He's already getting ready to ask for another $20 billion. He got 90 billion in March.
That's why he's doing flashy attacks on Moscow. And what I mean by flashy attacks is, for example, the big boom, if you've seen it, explosion with the lid that flies up several hundred feet in the air when an Asmongold reacted to it and was like all impressed. That's a fuel tank. Fuel tanks are the easiest thing to replace. Oil refinery, the equipment, that doesn't do a big boom like that, and it's much harder to replace. So they're prioritizing hitting like apartment buildings, something that will have people making videos from multiple directions, and fuel storage tanks that'll explode in a way that can be seen for miles. Zelensky's going for the optics in his attacks. Except for things like the Storm Shadow missiles that we had the earlier today. Those are the real attacks to damage Russia. The one that hit the semiconductor factory today. Those are the real attacks. Moscow, that's more theater, and it's for the psychological impact.
From the European Union. In September, his finance ministry will do the numbers for next year and realize they need another 90 billion for next year because there's no sign the fighting will end before the end of this year, as far as I can see it. So everything he says is music to the ears of his Western backers. And he's a dictator, and he needs to have an enemy. His enemy is Russia, so he's trying to look tough. But the problem is that, of course, that Russia could escalate at any moment, and it is several steps down the ladder from where it could be in terms of its capabilities. Putin has held off doing that. He's hit, with some Ovechnik strikes. Whenever the Ukrainians strike, he strikes. These arguments about, well, stop the missile attacks or we'll burn Moscow.
Yeah, I believe Russia has boosted its military to like 2.1 or 2.2 million. And it's deployed against Ukraine 500,000, I think. So it still has a lot in reserve.
It's all a bit circular because, if Ukraine were to stop its missile strikes, Russia would probably agree to do the same. So that requires diplomatic negotiations, which haven't been happening. And, Zelensky's letter, frankly, which was a joke at the start of June, was, and by the way, I read it on Instagram. It wasn't exactly a diplomatic cable. It certainly wasn't diplomatic. It's just really, he's not really talking to Putin at all. It's just several pages of insults with, well, actually, why don't we meet to end the war because you're getting old and you might soon die, Slava Ukraini, something like that. It was so ridiculous. But I mean, his game is to cling on to power, to keep dragging in money, to eventually hopefully bring the West into the war to join Ukraine. He is making Europe, Zelensky is making Europe less safe. And that is the truth of it. He's causing all sorts of human rights abuses inside of his own country. He's massively corrupt. Lots of the people around him are massively corrupt. And nobody will call him out on it because, he's our son of a bitch. So it's a desperate situation. The only way to...
It's not surprising. We have the same... Since we work, United States and the West, with all types of dictators and like Saudi Arabia, give you an example, Qatar. We don't care much for democracy as long as people in power do what we want.
When this war is to take Zelensky out of the equation. I'm afraid that is the truth of it, because he is leading his country very badly, and he's leading us all into Armageddon, potentially. And it's bizarre, though it may sound to say it, having served in Moscow under the watchful scrutiny of Russian intelligence on a day-to-day basis. But at the moment, it's Putin holding us back from World War III. It's strange, though it is to say that.
Well, and that kind of leads me into a couple of questions. Those videos, Gary, if you can start rolling that tape again you just were playing there, that is not just some minor shots here. I mean, those are some major shots in Moscow. These huge explosions, these massive clouds here, drones flying and falling all over the place, missiles falling in.
Yeah. Apparently, some of the drones going into Moscow had a lot of fuel in them. That means actual gasoline. You saw that huge explosion like that?
These huge explosions, these massive clouds here.
It's flashy, but that drone that size should normally not cause an explosion like that if it had proper actual explosions to damage stuff. These are drones, think of them half fireworks nearly. But it is doing damage, but not as serious as the West would want, but it is psychologically it's really effective. No one wants to live in a city where there's stuff like this going on.
Drones flying and falling all over the place, missiles falling in. I mean, this does make it look like Russia cannot stop what's going on here. And what is two questions? First of all, what is the view as far as you understand inside of Russia when they see all of these things, especially that one there? I mean, huge.
You see, the lid. That's a fuel tank. That it's just basically a steel cylinder. It's not particularly valuable strategically.
Cauldron cab was blown hundreds of feet up into the air, along with the resulting fire and everything.
But it makes an impressive spectacle and is like a big fire because it's, of course, it's filled with fuel.
Yes. What are the people in Russia thinking about this? Are they just mad at Ukraine, or are they saying, "Hey, you can't protect us, Vladimir Putin"?
Well, the signs I get, certainly the people I speak to inside of Russia, is that people are tiring of this war. They want to see it end, but they're not going to see it end on Zelensky's terms. That they consider Zelensky to be a complete puppet, of the West. I think most Russians actually want the war to come to an end. But I mean, there has to be, for that to happen, there has to be real diplomacy, and Zelensky has avoided that at all costs, as have his Western backers. So there's no.
When you say the Russian people want to see it come to an end, on what, like, hey, just make a negotiated settlement, get it off the table however you want, or as I've heard some say, no, they want it to come to an end with a Russian victory, hit the gas on there. Which of those two things do you understand?
No, I mean, I think for most ordinary people, they just want it to come to an end. There is a faction, the hardline faction within Putin's circle, that doesn't dream of any sort of future with Europe, that's written off Europe, that basically want to obliterate, Ukraine, basically take over.
The thing is, there's no way to just get it easily to come to an end. Ukraine has no intention to stop. Ukraine, the entire purpose of all this is to collapse the Russian government and put in a, balkanize Russia and put in West, puppet states everywhere into all the smaller countries. And that's the end goal. So it doesn't, even if Russia said, okay, we've got the land we want, we're ending this, Ukraine would still keep on sending the drones. It's until you take out Zelensky and his government in Ukraine, the drone attacks, and Ukraine is never going to start fighting. So there is no easy way out for Russia except to win.
The country, including all of the Russian-speaking parts of the country, Kharkiv, Sumy, Odessa, Mykolaiv, the other 4 oblasts, there is very much a constituency, within the political elite that want to do that. There's also a more Western-leaning constituency that doesn't want to do that, that dreams of a future with Europe. And I think secretly Putin doesn't want to write off the possibility of some sort of normalization with Europe in the future.
But that's the far future. After the far right starts coming to power in Europe and the globalists are gone, and then it might be possible. But right now, for example, UK, Keir Starmer has resigned, but the exact same. His replacement is going to do exactly the same policies on everything. It's basically one puppet, globalist puppet. Is replaced by another. So there's no hope of Europe coming around and being someone Russia can work with, at least not in the next 2 or 3 years. So
seems crazy, but he is one of the most pro-European. Doesn't sound like it. Obviously, right now we're in the middle of a war, 4.5 years. But actually, there is a big constituency in the political elite that
I think that. More than wanting to work with West, it's waiting for the West to collapse. The globalist regimes, and whoever comes in power will be more sane and not so absolutely fanatically driven to attack Russia.
Does dream of some sort of normal relationship between Russia and Europe in the future, and the reason for that is because to the east they've got China, and to the east, the far east of Russia is very sparsely populated. We're talking about 1 person per square kilometer. So, Russia sees threats from both directions. And actually, a lot of people want a relationship with Europe in the future. Some say, solid, let's just obliterate Kiev. Let's just take these other 4 oblasts. Let's just completely run them into the ground and so on. And, unfortunately, those voices are growing in intensity right now. And the longer this goes on, the more Putin may take heed of them. It took 8 years from the Ukraine crisis starting in February 24.
It's not only that. It's not only how things are going. It's the direction things are going in terms of the provocations by Europe. The signing of this missile license agreement by Trump that means that European states are going to be sending more missiles to Ukraine. If that doesn't work, there'll be more escalation some other way. It's every time Putin doesn't strike back at Europe for a clear attack by Europe on Russia, they get emboldened and attack Russia in every way possible. Just use the excuse, oh, it was Ukraine who did it. That's the situation we're in. And Russia is starting to take damage from these constant drone attacks. If missiles are added in, they start taking more serious damage. They could actually severely impact their ability to produce weapons, for example. Now, do you want to establish your red lines and escalate things while you still have the ability to make weapons, or after the West has, this Storm Shadow missile attack on a semiconductor? Do you want to lose a few more semiconductor factories before you decide to get serious? And And by the time you decide to get serious, you no longer have the ability to make vast quantities of weapons. It's stupid. Escalate, enforce your red lines now before you're in a much, much worse position.
14, where there's this kind of coup against Yanukovych, to a war breaking out. Not a lot happened. There was a separatist insurgency. For most of that time, Putin was pinning his hopes on some sort of devolved settlement through the Minsk II agreements, which the Americans and the British scuppered without getting into.
I never believed those would go anywhere. Trump can't, because Ukraine conflict, there's too many other parties that he has no control over. Europe and Ukraine. And not only that, you have his own deep state that's committed to this war. And him alone, all he can do is limit the direct flow of weapons from the United States to Ukraine, but he can't bring an end to it. He doesn't have the leverage or the willpower. I mean, by that, I mean his priorities are domestic, or at least they were domestic in terms of deportations and stuff. And so why is he going to burn political capital to end the Ukraine war? He's not. He's going to save whatever political capital he has for somewhere else.
Some history lesson around that. So there was a lot of restraint in the 8 years before the war started. So, Putin could go in harder. I feel we're getting closer and closer to the point in which he'll feel that he has no alternative to, particularly if Zelensky keeps hitting Moscow and having big fires. And from Zelensky's point of view, he says, bring it on. He's got the money. Britain keeps giving him the weapons, helping him build new weapons. So there's nothing holding Zelensky back. There are a lot more things holding Putin back. I think that's the big difference between the two men.
Okay, so let's take a look at those.
There's also the Iran example where they hit back at everyone that was attacking them. The states hosting U.S. Bases and letting U.S. planes take off to bomb Iran. Those states were targeted, and it worked out very well for Iran. So you have people in Russia okay, why don't we attack the places those the weapons that are hitting us are coming from? That means the EU.
Two different camps in Russia for the moment.
Yeah.
The hardliners, I think that's pretty clear, and that gets most of the headlines. But it seems to me there's a problem internally on Russia for that other constituency. And you can tell me whether that's medium, large, or small, however big that constituency is percentage-wise. But if they just, for example, just said, all right, you know what, the current line of contact, we'll just call it a day. We'll just take just get this over with however you want to so we can get back on with life. It seems like that's going to cause a lot of problems because then it will have demonstrated that Russia has limits of power, that it couldn't even conquer the rest of Donbass, much less anything.
Yeah, what this guy said about there being a constituency in Russia who just wants the war over, I have not heard that from anyone that's in the know. I think the feeling I get is they just want it over with in that stop holding back, just end this. Because honestly, right now, Putin is still, this operation in Ukraine isn't full war, at least from Putin's side. It's a special military operation. It's not war. Russia is not going full force in Ukraine. And I think that's what's pissing people off.
Anything else in Ukraine. And then after all this time, everything NATO did worked, and it seems like it's going to lock in NATO on the border and do it. If anything, it's going to increase it. That would seem to be a cost of just getting the war over with however they wanted to, even within Russia. How do you see it?
Maybe people will want it, but it's not possible because Ukraine is not going to accept that. So the only way to get Ukraine to accept a peace is to get rid of Zelensky. You're going to just have these drones continue on and on. Unless Russia surrenders and gives Ukraine what it wants and withdraws from all of this territory, and even the people in Russia that wants this over, they're not for withdrawing from Donbass. So the only way to get this over more quickly is to escalate, but that has serious risks.
Well, I mean, Russia can occupy the whole of Donetsk. It's now actually making significant advances in Kostyantynivka. That leaves only the Dzhizhinka.
This summer, in a month or two, Russia will have complete control over the Donetsk. It already has all of this except this tiny sliver. It has all of this. It has all of this, and the only thing missing is this little sliver right here, I think. And it won't be long. This could be this year or this summer.
Kramatorsk and Sloviansk, that could take another year, 2 years to kind of conquer at the current rate of progress. We all know that. But Putin had been prepared to deal with this Anchorage formula in which, the unoccupied parts were shared in some sort of free economic zone. So, the compromises were there, and the Russians were willing to make those, compromises. I mean, but again, any deal, Danny, involves a negotiation between both sides, and that, the Ukrainians keep playing games. The Western Europeans are just not interested in that process. So yeah, they want a deal, but first to get a deal, you need to have a negotiation, and that is what has been completely missing.
Well, and then that's the other side of the coin I want to look at next. So that's kind of the two different camps inside the Russia. Let's forget about Ukraine for the moment. I think it's pretty self-evident what their desires are. But let's look at Europe. What do they intend to accomplish? Now, before I mock the position here, maybe there's more to it, because if there's a growing camp inside of Russia that just wants the war over and might accept those less than the June 2024 terms,
Ayatollah Khomeini.
Hello there, Potential Selexio. Nice to have you here, Ayatollah Khomeini. We're focusing on Russia today because that's the area where I think the danger of escalation lies. The Iran situation, I think that'll be wrapped up by August, but by that same time period, I think it's very likely Russia will have struck EU, so that's fun. Nice to have you here.
Maybe these kinds of things, these strikes and whatnot, and this mocking thing of Zelensky might actually have a chance of success. Are they right?
No, they're not. I mean, I think the truth is you can't win a war by committee, and Europe is essentially one big committee. They can't really decide anything quickly, but what they can agree on is that they hate Russia. You look at anything that Radek Sikorski and his wife Anne Applebaum say, they despise, Russia. And, their only desire, this is not a plan or strategy, their only desire is to conquer Russia. They've got no idea of how they can do Russia.
Conquer. That's what they want. They want Putin gone. They want Russia broken up into pieces, and all those pieces ruled by Western chosen puppets.
But what they do see as an opportunity is to keep hammering Russia with the Ukrainians, helping Zelensky fight to the last Ukrainian. They have no other plan beyond that. You look at the Poles, for example, they don't want to send their troops in.
Well, right now, Ukraine is not costing Europe anything except maybe money. It's not costing any lives. All the dying is being done by Ukraine. And it's a wonderful situation for UK. It can take its Storm Shadow missiles, ship them to Ukraine, and then launch them into Russia. Isn't this the best way to wage a war against a country? Like, you can attack that country all you want, and that country can't hit you back. It's great for Europe, as long as Putin is doing the stupid, never enforcing his red lines.
Fighting Ukraine. They've got a difficult relationship with Ukraine as well as with Russia, as we've been seeing playing out over the past week.
Because that was a red line. Missile strikes deep into Russia was an absolute red line that Putin set. And it's been several times now, even today, it's been broken.
This business over this kind of Ukrainian neo-Nazi from World War II.
So I don't think Putin should even bother trying to establish red lines if he's never going to enforce them.
Was repatriated, his bodily remains, and all those things, the war's being removed. The French are not going to fight for Ukraine. The French see that when Ukraine joins the EU, if they get the same benefits as France, then all the French farmers are going to lose their subsidies. So, Europe is in a schizophrenic, the truth is that Europe is in a really schizophrenic position on its policy towards Ukraine. On the one hand, yes, let's kind of keep poking the bear and helping Zelensky fight to the last Ukrainian. But then, you belong in the European family, but wait a minute, actually, we're not so sure whether we really want you to join, because you don't have the...
Ukraine is not joining the EU anytime soon, at least not for another decade at minimum.
Money, and that will cause massive political disruption if you do. So it's hugely disingenuous, mendacious on the side of the Europeans, and each country in Europe is playing its own game. The Poles are playing their game. The Balts are playing their game, driven by their kind of hatred for Russia dating back to the Soviet period. The French are playing, the Germans, in amongst this, see themselves as becoming the most mighty army in Europe. Yeah.
Yep, we're focusing on Russia today because that's where World War III starts, maybe.
It feels like a slight rewind on history, coming down the track at us. So, yeah, they're all playing their own game. And there's no central planning. The people at the top, Kai Kallas, Ursula von der Leyen, they're just interested in clinging to power in their unelected offices. So the whole thing's a mess, Danny.
Yeah, it's inertia. It's the system set up, like globalist, this desire to go after Russia. It's part of a globalist agenda to just bring all of Europe together under control of the EU long term. And the EU is under basically control of the US deep state. So during the entire... And they've succeeded. They brought more and more. They brought the Baltic states into line. They had a color revolution, brought Ukraine into line. They've tried to several times to do a coup to bring Belarus into line. And now they're going after Russia. There is no thinking whether this will work or whether this will destroy Europe. It's the people in charge of Europe don't care about Europe. They're working for an EU, EU superstate. Whether the individual people of UK get fucked over by all this doesn't matter to them. Keir Starmer is part of the Brussels elite. That's what he cares about, going along with the plan. And so what I'm saying is there's no way to turn it off. Like, if this Ukraine war looks like it has no chance of success, there's no, like, giving up. This is a one-way machine that's built into, it's going to keep trying till it works. Look how it took 10 years to take out Assad. They never stopped. It's one way. And this will continue as long as U.S. hegemony over the world continues. Until that breaks, yeah, we're never going to have peace.
Well, it is, and a lot of the people in Ukraine are paying the price for that mess.
Exactly.
I want to go back to this one comment I made here a second ago, where I showed you that Zelensky had given an ultimatum.
Well, they've already joined NATO, I believe, and that's a big problem in of itself. The EU, that like Norway has oil, and I don't know if the economics side of that, I'd have to watch a video on it, but militarily they're integrating into Europe.
Made them to Belarus to say, hey, you better stop doing, helping out Russia, or we're going to come in and take care of it. I want to show you a couple of responses to that. First of all, Sergei Lavrov, who was kind of giving not only a repudiation of that, but also a bit of a warning.
И хотел бы в этой связи напомнить тем, кто в Киеве занимается подобного рода пропагандой и угрозами, что и тем, кто на Западе занимается тем же самым, поддерживает нацистский режим, что с марта 2025 года действует договор между Российской Федерацией и Республикой Беларусь о гарантиях безопасности в рамках союзного государства. И в случае необходимости мы готовы предпринять весь комплекс мер, который предусмотрен договором, чтобы обеспечить безопасность нашего союзника и, разумеется, безопасность союзного.
So he seems to talk there about something like an Article 5 between Belarus and Russia with the Union State. And for those who may not be familiar, can you kind of explain to us real briefly, what is the Union State?
I can explain. I was listening to it in Russian, в рамках союзного государства, in the context of the Union State. Now, this is kind of like a throwback from the Soviet Union, where it's almost like a mini EU, Russia.
No, I'm in the U.S. right now, but I have lived in London and Paris, each one for like nearly a year. Oh, and I also lived in Switzerland for 9 years when I was really young. So that's apart from that, it's been the United States and 2 years in Russia. So still a majority in the States. I'm also from a DNA test. I think I'm 1/4 Swedish. So that was fun. I've never lived there though.
Russia and Belarus form like a mini EU with some sort of common macroeconomic sort of and customs, union activity going on there, common security arrangements and so on and so forth. You can drive from Moscow all the way to Minsk or get the train, as I've done a few times. A very interesting city, Minsk, without any border controls. So it does feel like, you're crossing from Russia into Belarus. It's almost like traveling internally within the EU, that it's borderless. So it's kind of like a miniature EU going on there. It's a very, very close union that stems back to the downfall of the Soviet Union.
And it used to be like that. The same relationship Belarus has with Russia. Just being able to drive back and forth across this border. That used to be Ukraine and Russia too. All this used to be just, you could just travel anywhere. Then... and 2/3 of Ukraine's trade was with Russia. Then there was a Maidan Revolution. U.S. put in a puppet government in Ukraine, and that puppet government banned any pro-Russian parties. They held election, and surprise, surprise, there was entirely pro-Western government in Kiev now. Not democratic at all. Yeah. That's when you had the South break away because they depended on Russia for all of their trade, and it's been a mess ever since.
In Belarus is a country of 8 million people, a small country in comparison to Russia. They are very close knit. The Belarusians, there is a Belarusian language, but they all speak Russian. People need to remember that this isn't just like Russia's relationship, for example, with Kazakhstan, which by the way is also very close. Belarus is its closest relationship in the former Soviet states, by a long way, actually.
Yep.
And so
the very name Belarus, I mean, it means a beautiful Russia. So no surprise it's closest to Russia.
So they have some sort of security guarantees or security arrangements between the two. If one attack on one is an attack on both, is that correct?
That's exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. So,
and if you want any example of a state that shouldn't exist, Belarus, I mean, beautiful Russia, that should have been part of Russia after fall of the Soviet Union. But we, United States, wanted to balkanize, so break it up into all these tiny little countries that we can then dominate and control. And it works out for us pretty well. We could EU controls all this, and yeah, we just Russia held on to Belarus.
That's what Lavrov said. He was telling that basically to Europe. You guys better remember, if you're talking about Zelensky attacking into Belarus, then that's going to be a bigger issue. Well, the same statement was made, or an even stronger statement was made.
Belarusians are beautiful. I know, but it's really, as a country, I mean, it's ethnic Russian. It speaks Russian. It's Russian. Why is it not part of Russia? At this point now, it's been a country for a while. It's maybe no need to integrate it now, but if the West tries to turn Belarus into do what it did to Ukraine to Belarus, that wouldn't go well, because that is far more ethnically Russian than Ukraine, and I don't think it would work.
By Lukashenko himself, the leader
Not that they haven't tried.
of Belarus, who went even a little farther in his comments.
Belarus is very vulnerable militarily. If Ukraine were to attack Belarus in the same way as it is attacking Russia, because Belarus is as clear as day to the Ukrainian military, we are well aware that our key infrastructure, industrial and logistical facilities, would come under attack. Well, as they have stated, they have already identified 500 such targets on Belarusian territory. Were to attack Kiev from Belarusian territory, the front line, for Russia, naturally, and for us as well, would be extended by 1,500 kilometers along the Belarusian-Ukrainian border. Given the current course of the war, we and the Russians would be unable to defend this section.
I don't know what this guy is talking about. It's actually, is he lying on purpose, or is he uninformed? Because Ukraine's the one who has manpower shortages. Everyone acknowledges that. And extending the border of the war to across the north of Ukraine, I think it would be a disaster for Ukraine, not. And it also bring in Belarusian army, which does have an army.
That NATO forces and the countries supporting Ukraine will deploy their troops onto Ukrainian territory. This war will take on a new dimension.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of an understatement. He's saying if this turns into a conflict and now you have both Belarus and Russia, and he's saying, look, our military capacity is quite small, and it is. And if you now have NATO forces coming in to help stabilize the situation, this thing could spin out of control. Is he right there, or is he exaggerating?
Well, he's exaggerating, as Lukashenko always does. And actually, yes, they are much more than the Russians and the Ukrainians' military, but they still have a military. And, there's no sign that NATO is going to put their own troops into Belarus. Actually, I think that is, completely fanciful. I think the challenge actually for Ukraine is whether it could sustain, a front line over a much longer sort of perimeter.
It can't, unless he's right about NATO sending troops into Ukraine, which I don't think Trump would go along with it. If like UK, France, Germany sent troops into Ukraine, that would remove the Article 5 threat, because Trump would not go along with it. He would not go along with French troops get killed in Ukraine and then France try to trigger Article 5. No, he wouldn't. It wouldn't work. So it might actually open up Europe to being attacked directly from Russia without United States retaliation.
Quite frankly, than what it's got now. It's struggling already as it is across the front line. It's struggling to introduce the manpower that it needs. It's busifying at an ever greater rate, massive amounts of desertions, as we know, people not registering their military kind of availability and that sort of thing. So I think actually opening another front line against Belarus would be problematic for the Ukrainian side, quite frankly. The challenge for Belarus is it's just largely an empty country. It's just full of forests. It's not very penetrable. It's like the lungs of Europe because it has so many trees, Belarus. It's not so easy for maneuver warfare as a place, actually kind of Belarus, and plus you have the Pripyat marshes as well. So, but I think actually the bigger risks are on Zelensky. But I think what Zelensky's been saying there is just more sign of him becoming increasingly unhinged. There's this whole fight he's been having with, the Polish president over awards and things like that. He made a...
Yeah, look at this. The dark green, that's forests. And there are a hell of a lot of them in Belarus. Yeah, even compared to countries around. lots of forests, and in northern Ukraine.
A statement the other day that, when the Europeans decided to join the diplomatic negotiations, he would decide which European, this kind of the leader of the poorest and most shattered country in Europe
Most
would
corrupt,
decide
right.
which European leaders would represent the negotiations. The guy has just become a complete megalomaniac. His main purpose is to cling to power, it seems to me. Now he's threatening to attack Belarus. I don't think that's going to work out very well for him, quite frankly. But Lukashenko always exaggerates, always exaggerates. And I think he's actually playing his cards close to his chest, because I think the Russians, some hawkish people on the Russian side will be licking their lips at that idea and just having a big wider front to kind of torment the Ukrainians with.
So we'll have to wait and see whether Zelensky is foolish enough to actually act on that. I mean, whether these repeaters or wherever these communication towers are, it's not like there's just one or two of them. And if he goes in and strikes those, it's not going to probably solve the problem he's thinking of, but it sure is going to cause some other ones. We'll see how that works out. I want to look now at kind of the European. We talked about them just a second ago from their perspective on this.
That's the same issue Russia has. It's not like Ukraine can just go in and attack these towers in Belarus without bringing Belarus into the war. Just like that's the risk Russia has, as it can't just send an Orishnik and destroy the factories making drones in the UK without having a risk of escalation.
And the interesting thing here, there was about 2 weeks ago at a Senate testimony, the Secretary of State Marco Rubio went in, and he was talking about, I think at the time it was an $8 billion package that we were giving to the Ukraine side. And he point blank said, hey, listen, we're not neutral in this. We're not a mediator. We're on the Ukraine side. We're helping them, which is different than how Trump entered into office, but we'll leave that where it is. The president of the European Council made, ironically, a very similar statement and pretty emphatic just yesterday.
The European Union is not, and we do not intend to be mediators. The European Union is on Ukraine's side. We have been with Ukraine through the war, and we will be with Ukraine after the war. Second, what it's...
Really? Even if Russia wins and puts in a pro-Russian government, will you pay for the reconstruction of pro-Russia Ukraine? Nah, you won't.
Clear also is, unfortunately, that we don't have credible signs from Russia that Russia wants to engage in serious negotiations for the time being.
Well, I think what he's just defining there as serious negotiations means so far Russia hasn't come hand in hand and told us they'll do what we tell them to do. So because Russia has been, they've never left.
They want surrender from Russia. They want Russia to agree, we'll get out of all of the Donbass and Crimea and do everything you want. No.
Table as far as I can see. How do you see that part of it?
Well, Costa's actually doing some backpedaling there because he's got in a lot of hot water with the European leaders, because his office did reach out to the Russians to open up a diplomatic back channel to start having dialogue with the Russians. And all hell broke loose with the Germans, the French saying, how dare you talk to the Russians? And now, cap in hand.
When was that? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Oh, that was just literally in the past couple of days.
Yeah, I heard about that, and they were not happy.
The past couple of days. So now cap in hand, he's saying, no, we won't act as a mediator, because he got in deep doo-doo because he tried to mediate and he got in trouble from the Europeans, kicking off.
I don't know why he would even try. The positions are so far apart between what Russia wants and what Ukraine wants. I mean, Russia basically wants regime change in Kiev at this point.
But the irony is actually that several European leaders for over 8 or 9 months now have been saying, well, we should talk to Russia. Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, has said it. Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, has said it. Bart de Wever, the prime minister of Belgium, has said it. Even Ursula von der Leyen has said it. But that's the point about you can't win wars by committee. They can never quite agree who the person is going to be that talks to Russia, let alone what they would talk about if they spoke to them. So that Costa remark is embarrassing, frankly, to watch, because he's been caught red-handed trying to talk to the Russians and people unhappy about it. His point about we see no meaningful signs that Russia wants to engage in negotiations is utter nonsense. It's the Europeans who are refusing to talk to Russia. It's Zelensky who's refusing to talk to Putin. I mean, he keeps doing all these stunts, that letter from the 1st of June, that thing in Istanbul in last summer, when Trump was pressuring Zelensky to have talks.
There was the Istanbul agreements. They would have brought an end to this war nearly right after it started. But Boris Johnson went to Ukraine and killed it. Everyone that died since then is basically on his head. Well, and his head and those who sent him.
Said, well, meet me in Istanbul, Putin, almost like he's inviting him in for a cage fight in MMA.
Right.
It's like, it's just one stunt after the other. Nobody in Europe wants to talk to Russians. And the cheek of it is they say that, actually, that we see no signs that the Russians want to talk to us. If all they did, Macron, Merz, maybe, and Ursula von der Leyen, the three of them, said, let's have a meeting, Putin would say yes. Of that, I am absolutely sure. They could choose some sort of neutral venue. That would be fine.
He says yes, even if he doesn't expect anything from it. He would still say yes.
If they just put the hand up and say, well, without Zelensky in the room, for a change, we'll just meet you, Putin, on some neutral territory, and we'll have a discussion about the way forward. He would say yes. Of that, I have absolutely no doubt in my mind at all. But they can't agree to talk to each other, let alone to anybody else. And it's just a joke, Danny. I'm afraid it's embarrassing. That Costa thing was embarrassing, particularly when you think about the context of his words. He's red-faced and having to essentially say, well, I didn't mean it. I didn't mean to try and talk to the Russians. It's embarrassing.
I didn't mean to do something that made sense. My bad. Okay, well, so I got to ask you.
Yes, they are captured. That's exactly it. They don't represent. Just look at everything Keir Starmer is doing, from immigration to Ukraine to. I need to go over the Keir Starmer resignation video where what was it? His name, Jake, was going over all the list of things. Yeah, they are completely against the people of the country they are, and the media enables that. The media enables him, Keir Starmer, for example, to govern Britain in a way that completely fucks over the British, and they will pretend that he's not doing that. They will pretend there's no migrant crime, no rapes going on, that fighting Russia is absolutely necessary, that Ukraine is a good guy. Just lie after lie after lie, and the media enables it all.
Then what is, if there even is such a thing as the European position, what is their plan if they don't?
If there was a functioning media, that speech by Keir Starmer, his resignation speech, would have been ripped apart for all the lies in it by the media, if it was honest.
I want to talk, I mean, surely, Ian, they've got to be able to count. They've got to be able to look at economic issues. They've got to be able to look at the balance of power of the militaries. They've got to see that a war of attrition is just never going to work out in Ukraine's favor. So what is the end state for them if there is one?
There isn't one.
Oh, man, that's not the answer I was looking for. Because that's, yeah, how can you be a person?
I will just say that about banking and banking cartels. What we have now in the West, they're not banks like that we used to have. Like we had in America 100 years ago. They're functionally as a toll a Ponzi scheme, and they're keeping stuff going through market manipulations, through looting countries via the IMF loans and stuff like that. It's not. Those aren't normally functioning banks. So you can't judge banks as a system by what the West now has, because they don't. I'd hate to even call them banks. I could go on for a while, but all the way our banking system has been gutted and has been undermined. It's not. It's one of those things that makes me saddest. I don't talk about it, but that's one reason I'm absolutely certain the dollar's collapsing. It's just how gutted our banking system is.
And not have an end state.
There is an end state, Danny, if they have a negotiated settlement. And that end state is that they'll all lose their political offices. And they know that, because they spent 4 years saying we'll beat Russia, and we'll ensure a strategic defeat of Russia, we'll break Russia up into several constituent countries, Ukraine will...
Yeah, and growth. GDP. The problem with GDP, it's like judging how rich someone is by how much they spend each month. And if they spend more, they must be richer. And someone like Asmongold, he must be poor because he doesn't spend much each month. That is the insanity of our GDP. So, for example, if a hurricane hits the United States, and a lot of people have to dip into their savings to rebuild their houses and buy a new car and everything like that, and now they're poorer because of it. They don't have they maybe have to loot their retirement savings to do that. But for the year the hurricane hits, that boosts GDP because it forces a lot more spending. I can go around and slash everyone's tires in my town and force people to buy new tires, and that'll boost the GDP of my town. That is the insanity of GDP. It doesn't look at the wealth aspect. Like, are people getting poorer as the spending is going up? Are they going into debt as the spending going up? Is the country drowning in debt as this GDP is going up? Because if GDP is being boosted by borrowing, and that ability to borrow comes to an end, you're going to have a collapse of GDP. It's happened before in countries. Like, countries lose their ability to borrow, or they had like a mine that was producing a lot, and then stops producing, and then the entire country's GDP collapse. It's a measurement that can change drastically. Because what someone spends each month, that's something that can change at drop of a hat.
Will win we'll take back Crimea and all these things. And they've been telling their voters for years at massive expense, impoverishing their voters, increasing joblessness.
Yeah, you have a country that everyone in the country is saving. And so when they make money, they save most of it. The GDP of that country is going to be lower. But the people in that country are getting richer and richer. And if Chinese consumers were to behave like U.S. consumers and not save and just binge spend, China would already dwarf our GDP if they just spent like crazy, like U.S. does.
Closing down factories across their country, energy costs are sky high because we refuse to buy cheap Russian energy. They said all this is worth it because we're going to win. The moment that they sign some sort of diplomatic agreement with the Russian side...
Oh, it will be a harsh U-turn, but it will make a lot of things right during the process. And bring a lot of people to justice that caused the mess to begin with. And, the best part is the whole media apparatus nonsense that have been lying to us for decades. That all comes crashing down.
They will have to tell to the voters that actually, we tried our best to win, but in the end, we couldn't win. And that will have devastating political consequences for all of them because they lied. All this time, Danny, they lied.
Exactly. That's one reason all these globalists are tied to Ukraine, is they lied. Once the Ukraine war ends, then there's a reckoning. Then people will go in and eventually start taking stock of how many people died on the Russian and Ukrainian side. And surprise, surprise, it will turn out that all these leaders in Europe were lying about who was doing most of the dying. It'll turn out that the catastrophic casualties were on the Ukrainian side. People like Kirchsteimer lied about it. They sacrificed Ukraine to not even really damage Russia. And yeah, there'll be a political reckoning across the entire Europe if the Ukraine war ends. That's why you have all these globalists that are wedded to it. They can't let that reckoning of truth happen.
They thought they could defeat Russia, and they have failed to do so. And that is why there is no plan, because they just don't know what to do.
Well, they're going to have to figure something else out. I don't know if they're going to get another job or what.
It's like what Trump was doing in the Iran war situation for 3.5 months since the war started. He wanted out, but he couldn't bite the bullet and basically capitulate to Iran. He took him 3.5 months to reach that point. It's European unions don't want to bite the bullet and recognize reality either. And I think they have less backbone, so we can accept more of the same. They're going to keep on lying right up to Ukraine goes under.
Because wars of attrition are nearly always won by the side that has the greater logistics, manpower, and the inputs, and that's not changed. That's still on the Russian side. But what might be changing, Ian, is that the Russian side might be changing. Vladimir Putin gave a comment, a statement this morning, I think it was this morning on Russian time, addressing kind of where he is on the war, and he sounded a little bit more angry.
Any chance of something as monumental as a global economic crash to happen because of the Iranian and Ukrainian war? I think so, but next year. These things takes time to work their way through the economy. Like next year, there's going to be a food crisis because of shortage of fertilizers that there was this spring. And that's only going to hit basically around January, February of next year is when I think probably even March is when you're going to have the spike in food prices, which is going to mean inflation around the world, put pressure on economies. But before that, we're going to have a spike in oil this summer. That's going to put pressure. Every time you have these prices go up, in fuel prices or food prices, that puts pressure on the U.S. consumer and pushes more into bankruptcy and to defaults. And right now, I did a video about it a long time ago, but there is in the shadow banking system, it's called. There is already, that'll be the next subprime crisis. But it takes time for it to play out. So next year, it'll be hitting the financial crisis. Because fuel prices go up this summer, companies struggle under it, and then eventually in the fall start laying people off. Then those people that are laid off in the fall, they start defaulting on their credit cards in the winter, and then those rising defaults in the winter start affecting credit instruments on Wall Street, and next year, that's when you actually have like banks in trouble. So if you want the general idea of how it's going to happen, you can see these things coming way ahead of time, but they take time to play out.
The potential for conflict has risen significantly in a number of regions around the world, including in Eurasia. We see that if earlier NATO countries limited themselves to supporting the Kiev regime, which came to power through illegal armed means and a coup d'etat, they are now openly saying in the West that they are preparing for war with us and are increasing their defense budgets. To justify this spending and the radical militarization of their states, NATO and European Union leaders continue, as before, to resort to false claims about an alleged military threat from Russia.
So that's he's referring to the claim there that it's always been saying that Russia's coming for us next. If they beat Ukraine, they're going to roll, I don't know, to Paris, down the Champs-Elysees. I don't know where they're going to go. But he said, yeah, that's never been true. And so
Russia has no ambition to take into Russia the hordes of migrants Europe has left in. Conquering Germany, France, UK, that would mean taking on this huge, violent migrant population. Russia doesn't want that. No way they want that. Europe is too much of a mess for anyone to want to conquer it.
There's been more and more aggression. There's been more using, you mentioned some of this at the top of the show, technical capacities, Storm Shadow missiles themselves, helping Ukraine with its own long-range missiles, long-range drones, etc.
Would the Far East, particularly the East Asia, be hit hard? They would be affected. What I see eventually happening is the reverse that happened. The Great Depression that happened. You had Germany. There was back in 1930s. That was borrowing tons and tons of money, and they were like the United States today, fueling the GDP by borrowing. And the place they were borrowing from was the United States. And the United States was a manufacturing powerhouse of the world, basically China. So you had United States, it was China, manufacturing everything, then lending money to Germans so they could buy the goods that U.S. was manufacturing. What happened was eventually it became obvious to everyone that Germany could not repay what they were borrowing. And so U.S. banks stopped lending money to Germany. Germany basically collapsed into hyperinflation. And on the U.S. side, you had the Great Depression, which was, now you had all these factories that now their markets overseas were gone because Germany and other places couldn't buy anything anymore. And U.S. consumer couldn't buy everything, so you had the factories go under. And that's where you had deflation in the United States, because you had all this extra producing capacity in the U.S. and no one to buy it. And it was so China is going to be in that situation eventually at one point, that the U.S. market will disappear for it, because eventually, once the financial system in the U.S. goes under, yeah, they won't have the money to buy stuff from abroad. And so you're going to have something. Let me put it this way. It was a very, very, very bad time in Germany, the Great Depression, a complete currency collapse, societal collapse. In the United States, it was just the Great Depression, which was bad. So China is probably going to have something. Maybe they can manage things better and have something less than the Great Depression, but they're at least going to have a recession when shit hits the fan in the United States. Who would be Far East hit hard? So China, China, when it's an exporter right now. It exports, has all these factories geared for exports. If its export markets disappear, it's going to be bad for China, and the banks that lend money to the exporters will get into trouble, and it'll be a big mess. So China needs. It'll happen at some point when that the ever-increasing amount of debt that the United States and Europe is struggling under, once that implodes, once it reaches the point where it becomes a debt spiral and people don't trust them and lend them money anymore, and they start printing money, and Europe and the United States won't be able to buy as much from China, and so Chinese exporters will have a big problem. Though, I will say this. Yes, the Great Depression was bad for the United States, but look what happened afterwards. The United States emerged as the world's superpower. That's what's going to happen to China too. It's going to be a global crisis, which is particularly bad for Europe and America, and it's going to be bad for China too. But it's going to recover faster, and it's going to be what the United States was after World War II. Because we outsourced our manufacturing to China, our prosperity to China. And so we gave them the superpower status when we did that. It took a few decades to play out.
Using NATO airspace in some cases to get through there, and the targeting issue. And it looks like that Russian patience is starting to wear thin, and Putin seems to be warning something more. Is this, you talked about how Lukashenko a minute ago was exaggerating, so there's probably no threat from that. Is Putin doing the same thing?
Well, I sense no exaggeration there from Putin at all. He's always very measured in what he says. He lays out the facts as he sees them. And some of those facts are pretty hard to dispute. I mean, all of the European NATO...
Incidentally, I think Russia is the country best poised to handle the collapse of the dollar. And China is going to be hurt because it exports all these consumer goods to the world, and that's going to hurt. But Russia is the most insulated economy from all this, and I think it's going to chug along just fine while the rest of the world struggles.
So countries are committed, and this is, by the way, Donald Trump's fault because he encouraged this, to increase their military spending to 5% of GDP by 2035. I mean, that is written in, that's locked in, people are doing it. The Germans are pressing ahead, with that. It is true.
The way the United States became the biggest manufacturer of the world was tariffs. We were the most tariff-happy country on earth going into, the Great Depression. And so that's why, because it was too expensive to make something outside the United States and ship it to the United States because of tariffs. So everyone had built their factories in the United States. I wonder if Michael Blurry was still alive today, he would share that same analysis. Well, it's you can just look at history, and the United States was what China was. I say it so much because it annoys me, it angers me so much that we outsourced our manufacturing, but we were the powerhouse of the world, and manufacturing is the underlying strength of an economy. You protect it, you don't outsource it.
That whenever you read any mainstream newspaper, at some point during any given week, Danny, you'll see a report from some German stroke French stroke Italian stroke British stroke Estonian general. I don't think Estonia has enough troops to have a general, but we'll set that issue to one side, saying Russia's going to invade us next year in 2028, or maybe 2029, or maybe 2030, but they're definitely going to invade. So, this is happening all the time at a time when Europe is increasing its defense spending on the basis that, people keep making these false claims, and I do believe they're false, because if he'd wanted to strike NATO, he'd have done a long time ago, rather than waiting so long. That Russia's going to attack NATO. It's not going to attack NATO. It's not in Russia's interests, and has never.
It wasn't in Russia's interests, but now the dynamic has changed. It can't allow all these drones to keep flying into Russia, especially if missiles are added to the mix, without responding, because Russia will end up taking too much damage.
Never been in Russia's interest to attack NATO, quite frankly. So what he's talking about is what he sees in the West, and what lots of realists like you, like me, also see, that, defense spending is going up, scaremongering is going up, and he's just pointing this out.
But now, is there a scenario, because there has been a lot of talk of it here lately, where Russia may strike outside of Ukraine, especially if these strikes continue on and hitting deep into their country, by striking factories where drones are made, where missile components are made?
Yeah, I think that's going to happen this year at some point. People might resist it. Putin might resist it for a while, but the drones being shot into Russia, that's only going to intensify. More and more drones going to Ukraine, going to be shot into Russia. And plus add missiles to it mix. There's going to start being more school children being killed by drones, more dormitories being attacked by drones. It's just going to escalate. And at some point, you have to respond.
That are used inside of Ukraine against Russia. There's been some claims, and I think you probably have seen some. Karaganov has even said on Glenn Deason's show and some others that, hey, we may be needing to strike some of these targets inside of Europe as a reestablished deterrence. Do you see that as a possibility?
I do. I don't think we're there yet. I think there are a couple of escalation steps that
there yet, but
Russia can take within Ukraine before it gets to that. By the way, that also includes the use of tactical nuclear weapons inside of Ukraine. I think we're not at the stage where Putin's going to roll that dice, because that is a big escalation step up the ladder. And yes, Storm Shadow, we're paid.
What would I prefer? A nuclear weapon used against Ukraine, or Oreshnik against a factory in UK? I'd prefer the Oreshnik, because you don't want nuclear weapons used. You don't want to take that cat out of the bag. Or changes the entire dynamic of every conflict on Earth, including the Iran conflict. It makes Israel much more likely to nuke Iran if Russia uses nukes. So I don't want that.
Paid for by the Brits. I mean, all of Ukraine's military kit, all of its ammunition, it's all paid for by us already. So we've been knees deep in this war from the very beginning. Yes, we've given them more and more sophisticated kit. They're using it deep inside of Russia. They're using our intelligence to target and that sort of stuff. Our knees are getting further deep into the mud. But we don't actually have our avowed troops on the ground in Ukraine at this time.
No, but the launching of drones from the Baltic states, that is an act of war against Russia. From my perspective, EU and Russia are already at war. Because that's drones from outside of Ukraine, from through NATO airspace into St. Petersburg. If Putin's not going to respond to that, I mean, he has no red lines.
Of course we do, in some specialist roles, of course, but we don't have troop formations as such. So I think that is becoming a greater possibility. I don't see that as a short-term possibility. I do see a big escalation within Ukraine itself as a very real short-term possibility, possibly. I mean, I was talking to Stanislav Krupnik earlier today, and he was talking about basically landing a nuclear weapon on Lviv in the far west, right on Poland's border, and getting people to think about that, for example. And he was serious about that. So I mean, he's on the. I mean, he's a friend of mine. I mean, I've got nothing against him. Former U.S. Army officer, actually, as it happens. But he's very much on the hardline faction, you'd say. But this is what people are talking about: just nuke Lviv, right next to Poland, and say, well, okay, what are we going to do next? And people are talking about this openly now. Karaganov was talking about using nuclear weapons. This is not Medvedev who says random stuff.
Yeah. Attack Europe conventionally first before you go to nukes. I'd be disappointed if Russia jumps right to nukes. That's just stupid.
Just to act as a bit of a lightning rod, more and more people are talking about this now, and people should sit up and ask themselves whether we really want to be getting it to that stage. Because, I mean, before we even hit NATO, Russia could do a hell of a lot more damage within Ukraine than it's done so far. A hell of a lot more. I mean, you all know their military capabilities better than me. It's been very attritional. They've not put too many troops into the fire. They've been sort of taking it slowly, bleeding the Europeans white. We're getting closer to a Hail Mary right now, but I think that would be within Ukraine itself.
And before Russia used nukes against Ukraine, it would give a warning. It would tell civilians to evacuate. So it wouldn't just drop it by surprise. And so at least there's that. If Russia warns people in Ukraine to evacuate the entire region, start watching out because nukes might be flying.
Yeah, and I'm going to touch on that in just a second here, but given those more hawkish views inside of Russia, you can see that they've been given a little bit of oxygen up in the Kremlin. See, that's a pretty strong statement there. He said, if we are directly at war with Ukraine, with NATO and the United States and Europe, we may have to change the nature of the conflict, which you see feeds right into what Mr. Krupnik said there, or Mr. Karaganov said, et cetera. And one has to wonder, are they dragging Putin more in their camp? What do you think?
Yeah, they are. I mean, I think it's not they're dragging him into this camp. He always has two camps, the hardliners and the moderates. I mean, people don't...
The assassination attempt against Putin last December, that did a huge number on Putin, and that's really pushed him in more into the hardline camp.
I realize that there are moderates in Russia, but there really are moderates in Russia. I know a lot of them very well. But he's finding it harder to ignore the hardliners. I think that's the truth of it. And what he's saying there is very much for them, as it was for NATO countries, to show them that he's thinking about doing this. But I still think there's some way off that. What I do think is possible, and I've been talking about this quite a lot lately, is that...
I mean, Iran was surprised by how easily it won the Iran war, and how easily United States bases were destroyed in the region, and how weak the United States actually was. I think that some people, the moderates in Russia, are overestimating what the West is capable of, and are fear NATO more than they should, because I don't think Trump is going to be excited to wage war against Russia, and Europe without US is nothing.
Russia sinks a NATO ship in international waters. I think that that is much more likely. You saw the Royal Marines seize a tanker in international waters in the English Channel.
Yep.
I think, and then shortly afterwards, Admiral Grigorievich, fired a warning shot at a British yacht that's sailing nearby. I think that's where the flashpoint's going to come, actually, because Russia would feel it's able legally to defend that action as being in international waters, following a threat against its kind of economic interests on the high seas. But yeah, I mean, we're getting closer to a direct strike on NATO. I don't think Russia's going to strike first. I think, frankly, the first nuclear bomb lands on a Ukrainian city, everybody will want to talk. I think you know that as well as I do, Danny. I think, one nuke happens, then suddenly everything changes anyway. It doesn't matter if it's in Ukraine. Yeah. And suddenly I think the Europeans and the Poles, who don't have nuclear weapons yet, would suddenly find themselves, like Radek Sikorski, much more keen to negotiate at that point in time, I believe. Mm-hmm. And Russia knows that. I mean, there's a reason why Russia produces so many world chess champions. I mean, they're not going to Hail Mary on NATO before NATO explicitly does it on them. I just don't think reached that tipping point on the Russian side yet. Russia wants to avoid that. They've always wanted to avoid a direct conflict with NATO, and I believe that they still do. But time is running out.
Yeah, that is the problem, and really to reinforce your theory there. You recall, I guess it was about 3 weeks or so ago, a lot of noise, including Medvedev, but also Lavrov and several other Russian officials said, "Hey, you better get out of Kiev because of what they have done to us. We're going to strike them and hit them hard. We're going to hit decision-making centers. We're going to hit other command and control centers, but much bigger than has happened before." And nearly nothing happened. There was some strikes. There was some drone fire.
Yes, they haven't carried through on that threat yet. So maybe it'll change. Maybe it finally will happen, the strike that Russia's warning about. But so far, Putin seemed like a big chicken so far.
Some missiles, nothing out of the ordinary from what happened before. And so people think, well, it was just a bunch of hot air. Well, today, Sergei Lavrov says 2 months ago, we officially warned all foreign colleagues, both embassies and representative offices of companies, that we recommended that in order to avoid misunderstandings, evacuate from Kiev. This recommendation remains in force. That's just today. Why do you suppose that he's reissuing that today?
Well, Ukraine has just hit Moscow, and so Russia is going to hit Kiev even harder. I mean, that's just in the logic of their military statecraft. That's just what they're going to do. And so they're issuing a warning that, weapons are going to be, munitions are going to be landing heavy on Kiev. So, if you want to stay safe, then stay away, really. And that's why they're doing that. Every time Ukraine hits Moscow, St. Petersburg, Russia will always strike back. And if they can, and they normally can, they'll strike back even harder. And that is just how they...
But they're not striking back at the ones shooting at them. It's not Kiev that's shooting at St. Petersburg. It's the EU. And what type of... It does nothing for deterrence, ultimately. Why does UK care how hard you hit Kiev? It'll keep sending its Storm Shadow missiles to be launched into Russia. It cares nothing for the lives of Ukrainians.
They operate, and we know that. They know that we know that. And so he's just reinforcing that warning. That suggests that, there'll be missiles incoming possibly as we speak.
And so what do you think might be the sequence of events? Because you said you don't believe, from how you understand the Russians, you've lived...
I know what you're saying, Proton Snail, about they're holding back because of atrocities. We are hostages in sort of ways. Yes, exactly. That's why I don't really want nukes to be used, because it's not propagandized populations of the West that are the enemies. But that's why I think hitting the factories where the drones are made, and maybe give them like an hour advance warning so you don't kill civilians. You do what Iran did. That's what Iran did. It struck against the Gulf states. It told them which target they were going to hit, and there were no civilian deaths. It was just infrastructure destruction. Do that. Destroy the factories where the drones are being produced, and in a way that limits civilian casualties.
Lived and worked with them for a long time as a diplomat. What might be the sequence of events to even get to a nuke inside of Ukraine? Now, I would imagine that something's coming for Kiev here pretty soon, maybe more Oreshtiks or so, but how many more steps would have to go before you think that it's plausible or even concerning that there might be a strike inside of Ukraine?
Well, I think we're only 2 or 3 steps away from that point. I mean, so far, Ukraine is only hitting logistics. So they're hitting all the refinery at Gazprom Neft, all the refinery in Moscow. That created a big black cloud of smoke, right there. But, Zelensky right now, he could do anything. If Zelensky makes a move on Belarus, for example, suddenly launches a front against Belarus, seizes a significant amount of land in Belarus. That's one scenario. If there's an even harder strike deep inside of Moscow or something like that in the city center or in the center of St. Petersburg, it's hitting non-military facilities.
Get Russia to release the Epstein files. No, I think Russia's attention is focused on Ukraine, unfortunately. So I don't know if they really want to be... If they're going to hack something like hack Central Command in Ukraine and get... Ukraine's war plans is what I think they'd be doing.
Then that's another, there's this bus, shortly after the Belarus threat to Lukashenko, there was this kind of bus, actually in Russia, but it's full of Belarusian young sports kids, got hit by a Ukrainian drone. All of these things that the Ukrainians are doing, I mean, they seem to have no restraint on their action. And, a more serious attack by the Ukrainian side could finally make Putin snap and say, well, okay. You'll recall, Danny, in the run-up to the war, there was this kind of phony war where there were back and forth negotiations. It was obvious that Biden wasn't going to make any concessions to Russia in terms of its concerns on NATO enlargement. Ukraine officially killed the Minsk II agreement by saying that the Donbass would never have any devolution. That's Dmytro Kuleba. He made a comment to Polish media at the back end of January. There's this period where we were pretending to negotiate with Russia, and Russia knew all along that we weren't really serious about reaching any compromise with their concerns. And then just one day, and actually we saw the sign the day before when there's the attack happened the day after Defenders of the Fatherland Day in Russia. I remember at the time watching all these kind of military ceremonial layings of flowers of soldiers in full uniform laying flowers at war memorials in Russia. And I thought to myself, they're going in tomorrow, and they did. So, something's going to happen. You're going to see some big military parade or some commemoration happening in Russia. And then the day after, the bomb is going to strike. And it'll be as sudden as that. But watch out for the kind of the telltale signs a day or so before that happens. So, yeah.
It's hard for me to imagine whatever timing. It's hard for me to imagine that not happening because of something you identified earlier here. Is that number one? President Trump just gave up. He was going to end the war in a day and all this junk. Then he
gave up.
We're just kind of out and said, sure, we'll sell you some more bombs and missiles, whatever. So he's not even trying. Europe doesn't have a plan either, other than let's just keep giving money.
Yeah, no. Europe's plan is to just keep the thing alive until Democrats win Congress, and then maybe Democrats can force money to Ukraine. That is the plan on Europe's part right now. And then Democrats controlling Congress could force enough money through so they could last the next presidential election and maybe get a pro-Ukrainian president. That's the sort of long game of Europe's thinking right now.
Money to Zelensky, and I don't know, see what happens.
Well, Europe's plan was to thwart Trump at every turn. That was Europe's plan. Europe were determined. Well, they succeeded. So, that was their plan. Yeah. All this coalition of the willing, all these distraction techniques, their plan was to thwart. And Keir Starmer was the worst at this, was to prevent Trump advancing some diplomatic settlement in Ukraine. And as you say, they succeeded. Zelensky is now stronger than he's ever been. He's a puppet that we've created, and he's dragging us all towards Armageddon. And that's truth of it. And the sooner he's out of the picture.
Is he a puppet or is he a Frankenstein? I mean, I'm not sure which it is.
Well, I think he was a puppet, but I think now he's a puppet master, I fear. But yeah.
That's kind of how it's looking, and that's not good for anyone, Ukrainians, Europeans, or Russians, or mankind for that matter. We'll have to wait and see what's going to happen. But, man, really appreciate you coming on today. This has been a very enlightening episode, I can tell you. Thank you.
Always my pleasure, Danny. Nice to see you.
It's a very interesting video. The most dangerous situation in the world right now is definitely Ukraine, more so than Iran. Iran is, I think, heading for a solution. And that solution is going to be forced on Trump by the oil crisis this summer. It's going to wrap up, and not in the U.S.'s favor. But Ukraine situation, meanwhile, that's devolving. That's becoming worse. The threat of nukes is actually real. So that's what we need to keep an eye on. Anyway, this will be on YouTube. Like and subscribe. Come watch on Kit or Twitch, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.